I want to tell you something I have never told anyone outside of my closest circle. Not my board members, not my PR team, not even my personal assistant, who has worked with me for 11 years. I am telling you this now because I think you need to hear it. I think maybe I needed to say it out loud for a long time, and I just didn't know how. Let me start with the moment everything changed. I was sitting in seat 34 bytes, a middle seat. The kind of seat that no person in their right mind chooses voluntarily. The armrests were shared, the legroom was almost non-existent, and the man next to me was already asleep before we even pushed back from the gate, his arm spilling over onto my side in that relaxed, unbothered way that only people with zero self-awareness ever manage. The overhead bin above me was already full when I boarded, because I was one of the last passengers on the plane, which meant I had to put my carry-on 3 rows back and hope nobody accidentally grabbed it when we landed. I had not flown economy class in 14 years. My name is Nathan Kale. At the time this happened, I was 47 years old. The company I built from nothing, a logistics technology firm called Kale Wave, had just been valued at $4.6 billion. I had a private jet on retainer, a penthouse in Manhattan, properties in Aspen and the south of France, and a team of 12 people whose entire job was to make sure that my life ran smoothly. My coffee was always the right temperature. My schedule was always perfectly arranged. My shoes were always shined. And on a gray Tuesday morning in October, I was sitting in seat 34B on a commercial flight from Atlanta to Los Angeles, wearing a warm gray hoodie, a baseball cap pulled low, no jewelry, no watch, no anything that would signal to a single person on that plane who I actually was. Nobody recognized me. And that was exactly the point. But here is what I did not know when I buckled that seatbelt and settled into the scratchy upholstery of that middle seat. I did not know that the next 5 hours and 40 minutes were going to change me in a way that no business deal, no financial success, no award or recognition or milestone ever had. I did not know that I was about to meet someone who would make me question everything I had built, everything I had become, and everything I thought I understood about the world. I did not know any of that. All I knew when that plane finally lifted off the runway and climbed into the clouds above Atlanta was that I was exhausted in a way that sleep could not fix. Let me go back a few weeks because you need to understand what brought me to that seat. The idea started with my daughter. Her name is Maya, and she was 22 at the time, fresh out of college, doing that thing young people do, where they are full of opinions about everything and completely certain that the older generation has gotten it all wrong. Maya and I had never been especially close, partly because of my schedule, partly because of the divorce when she was 12, partly because of a dozen small failures of presence that I had never quite found the words to apologize for. But she called me one evening in September, and we talked for almost 2 hours, which was unusual for us. We talked about her plans, her frustrations, her fears about entering a world they felt increasingly unequal and unkind. And at some point, she said something that I could not let go of. She said, "Dad, I think the problem with people like you is that you forgot what it feels like to be invisible." I pushed back. I told her I remembered exactly where I came from. I grew up in Tulsa in a house with 1 bathroom and 4 siblings. I worked 2 jobs in college. I know what struggle looks like. And she said, very quietly, in that way she has, that is somehow more devastating than shouting. Knowing about struggle and feeling it are 2 completely different things. You used to feel it, now you just know about it. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up, longer than I would like to admit. Then something else happened. My company was in the middle of a difficult contract negotiation with a union representing warehouse workers at a distribution center we had acquired in Ohio. The workers wanted better conditions, better pay, better everything. My executive team kept sending me summaries, numbers, charts, projections, the optics of various settlement options. And I kept reading those summaries and feeling like something was missing, like I was making decisions about people while looking at them through the wrong end of a telescope. One of my senior advisors, a sharp woman named Delia, who has a gift for saying uncomfortable things in comfortable ways, told me at the end of a long meeting that I might benefit from remembering what it was like to not be Nathan Cale for a little while. She did not mean it as an experiment. She just meant it as a thought. But I could not stop thinking about it. So I made a decision. I was already scheduled to fly to Los Angeles for a conference. I told my assistant to cancel the private jet. I told her to book me a commercial flight, economy class, window seat if possible. She looked at me the way you look at someone who has just announced they are going to attempt something mildly dangerous, but technically legal. And she said, "Are you sure?" And I said yes. And then I said, "Actually, make it a middle seat." She blinked. She booked it. I told my security team to stand down for the trip. I told my PR person nothing. I dressed in the least Nathan Cale-like clothes I owned, which took more effort than you might expect, because even my casual wardrobe at that point was quietly expensive. I found a hoodie from a college I had donated a building to, a pair of dark jeans, clean but unremarkable sneakers. No watch, no rings. I left my regular phone at home and took a backup phone with a different number that my assistant had preloaded with a single contact in case of emergency. I drove myself to the airport in a rental car. I stood in the regular check-in line. I went through security with everyone else. I sat at the gate and drank a coffee from the airport Dunkin', and it was not very good, and I noticed how nobody looked at me even once. It was the first time in a very long time that I had been truly anonymous in public, and I did not expect how much that would feel like both a relief and a grief simultaneously. The gate agent called Group 5 for boarding, and I joined the back of a slow-moving line, and I shuffled down the jetway, and I found my row, and that is where I met her. Her name was Rosa. She was in seat 34A, the window seat next to mine. She was maybe 65 years old, perhaps a little older, with silver hair pinned up in a practical way and hands that told you immediately that she had spent her life working hard with them. She was wearing a blue cardigan over a simple floral blouse, and she had a small canvas tote bag on her lap that she was arranging carefully, taking things out and putting them back in a specific order with the focused attention of someone who travels carefully and deliberately, because traveling does not come easy. I settled into 34B, and she looked up and smiled at me. Not a performative smile, not a flight politeness smile, a real one, the kind that reaches the eyes and means something. I smiled back, and then I did what most people do in middle seats on airplanes. I got out my phone and started looking at it. The man in 34C, the one who fell asleep immediately, was large and rumpled and snoring before the safety demonstration even began. So it was really just Rosa and me in our little corner of the plane, separated by the armrest she had already graciously angled herself away from to give me more room, which I noticed and appreciated without mentioning. About 20 minutes into the flight, after the seatbelt sign had gone off and the flight attendants had begun their service with the methodical efficiency of people who do a difficult job very well and are almost never thanked for it, Rosa reached into her canvas tote and pulled out a small Tupperware container. Inside, it were cookies, homemade ones, with a golden brown edge that told you they had been baked by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She offered me one before she had even taken one for herself. I almost said no, the way you do reflexively, the way politeness sometimes teaches you to decline things offered by strangers. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the sincerity of the gesture. Maybe it was that I was genuinely hungry and the flight attendant had not yet reached our row. Maybe it was just that it smelled incredible. I said yes, thank you, and I took one. It was a brown butter chocolate chip cookie, and it was one of the best things I had eaten in recent memory, which is saying something because I have eaten at Michelin-starred restaurants on 3 continents. There was something in it that tasted like care, like someone had thought about every ingredient deliberately. I told her it was wonderful. She looked pleased in a quiet, unshowy way and said she always brought cookies when she flew because she never knew who might need something sweet. That small sentence told me a great deal about Rosa. Not all of it, but enough to make me want to know more. We started talking. Slowly, the way conversations begin on planes, with light things, easy things. Where are you headed? Do you live in LA or Atlanta? That sort of small orbit of small questions. I told her I was going to a conference. She nodded. She said she was going to see her son. There was something in the way she said it that made me wait. The way you wait when you sense that a simple sentence has weight underneath it that has not yet been revealed. She did not say more right away. She looked out the window, where the clouds were so thick and so white they looked like a geography of some other world entirely. And she was quiet for a moment, the way people are quiet when they are deciding how much to share with a stranger. Then she said, "He's in a hospital there. Has been for 3 weeks." I said I was sorry to hear that. She said his name was Daniel. He was 38. He had been in an accident. A car accident. Not his fault. Not anybody's fault, really. Just one of those terrible random moments that rearrange everything without warning. He had been in a coma for the first 10 days, and then he had come out of it, which everyone had called a miracle. But the recovery was going to be long, and she was flying out because she could not be away from him any longer, and also because she did not trust anyone else to handle his situation with the care it required. She said this all very evenly, very factually, the way people describe things they have already had to describe many times to many people and have learned to carry it a particular way so that they can keep functioning while they carry it. But her hands, while she spoke, were gripping the canvas tote bag on her lap, and I noticed that. I asked if she was traveling alone. Yes, she said. Her husband had passed 4 years ago. She had a daughter in Phoenix who wanted to come, but could not afford the time away from work. And Daniel had friends who had visited, who had been kind. But it was different with a mother. She said, it was just different. I asked where she was staying in LA. She mentioned a budget motel near the hospital. She said she had found it online, and the reviews were not great, but the price was manageable. And it was close enough that she could take the bus, and she had mapped the route, and she was going to be okay. She was going to be okay. She said it like a decision she had made, not like a fact she was reporting. I sat with everything she had just told me, and I did what I rarely do in my day-to-day life, which is just sit. Just be present. Just listen without immediately trying to solve or strategize or respond. And then I said, "How long are you planning to stay?" She said she did not know exactly. She had bought an open-ended ticket because she had used her savings, and the one-way was cheaper in the end, and she would figure out the return when Daniel was stable enough that she felt she could leave him. I did not say anything for a moment. Outside the window, the clouds were shifting, pulling apart in long dramatic streaks to reveal the earth far below, brown and vast, and crossed with the thin silver thread of a river. I asked her what she did for work. Past tense, she said with a small smile. She had been a school cafeteria manager for 27 years. She had retired the previous spring. The timing had felt like a gift at the time because she had so many plans. A garden she wanted to build. A quilt she had been starting and abandoning for 3 years. A trip she and her neighbor had been vaguely talking about taking to the Smoky Mountains. And then Daniel's accident happened 6 months into her retirement, and the plans went into a drawer, and here she was. She said it without bitterness. That was the thing about Rosa that I kept noticing. There was no bitterness. There was sadness, yes, and there was exhaustion visible in the careful way she moved, and there was worry under everything like a bass note that never quite stopped. But bitterness? No. She seemed to be someone who had decided, somewhere along the way, that carrying bitterness was a weight that would not help her get anywhere she needed to go. The flight attendant reached our row, and I ordered a ginger ale, and Rosa asked for water, and the flight attendant handed them over with the automatic efficiency of a person who had done this 10,000 times. And Rosa said thank you in a way that made the flight attendant actually pause and look at her, actually see her for a second, before moving on down the aisle. That was another thing about Rosa. She thanked people in a way that landed. We ate our plastic-wrapped snacks, and she offered me another cookie, and we talked. Not about me, mostly. She asked a few general questions, the kind you ask to be polite, and I answered them vaguely but honestly. I said I worked in technology. I said I was from the Midwest originally. I said I traveled a lot for work. She nodded and did not push further, and I was grateful for that. But she talked. Once she had decided to talk, she talked in the way that people talk when they have been holding things carefully for a long time and have found someone who seems genuinely willing to listen. She told me about Daniel as a boy, how he had been a difficult teenager, rebellious in the exhausting way that good kids sometimes are, testing every boundary she set with the kind of dedicated persistence that, she said, she secretly admired even when it made her want to pull her hair out. How he had eventually found his way into social work, helping at-risk youth, which was the kind of work that paid almost nothing and asked almost everything of a person, and which he did anyway, because it was what he cared about. She said that when he described his work to her, he used the word calling, and she believed him. She told me about her husband, a man named George, who had worked in construction for 40 years and had the bad back and the hearing loss to prove it, and who had been the kind of husband who left little notes on the kitchen counter, not for any occasion, just because. She said she still found his handwriting sometimes on old grocery lists or pieces of paper tucked in jacket pockets, and that it still stopped her cold every time. She told me about her garden plans, speaking of them in the future tense, in a way that made me realize they still mattered to her, still lived in her as something she was going toward, not something she had set aside forever. She wanted tomatoes, she said, and zinnias, and a bench in the right corner where the afternoon light came in longest. I told her it sounded beautiful. She said it would be. We were maybe 2 hours into the flight when I excused myself to use the restroom, which required an elaborate negotiation around the sleeping man in 34C, who turned out to be a remarkably deep sleeper. And when I stood in the narrow aisle and walked toward the back of the plane, I passed row after row of people. And I looked at them, really looked, the way I never do in the normal rush of my life. There was a young woman in the aisle seat of row 40, bent over a textbook with a highlighter. Her free hand holding her head in that posture of someone running on, got enough sleep and too much ambition. There was an elderly man 2 rows forward who was holding a photograph, just holding it, looking at it with an expression that could have been love or grief, or probably both at the same time. There was a teenage boy in a window seat with his headphones on, drumming his fingers on the tray table in an irregular rhythm that matched whatever was playing in his ears, his face completely at peace. All these lives, all these whole enormous lives, packed into seats separated by a few inches of plastic. I stood in the tiny bathroom and looked at my face in the mirror, and I thought about what Maya had said, that knowing about struggle and feeling it were 2 different things. I thought about Rosa in her seat, going to a hospital in a city she barely knew, to sit with her son in a recovery that could take months, staying in a motel with bad reviews, because she had done the math, and that was the math. I thought about my board meetings, my strategy sessions, my carefully modulated conversations about labor relations and productivity metrics. I thought about the hundreds of people who worked in our facilities, people I had never met, whose conditions and wages and daily realities I discussed in percentages and projections while they actually lived them. I washed my hands. I went back to my seat. Rosa had taken out what I now recognized as a rosary, and she was moving through it quietly, her lips not quite moving, her eyes forward, doing something private and sustaining. I did not interrupt it. I got back into my seat quietly, and I looked at the seatback screen in front of me without really watching it. And I sat with everything I was feeling, which was more complicated and more present than I had let myself feel in a very long time. When she finished, she tucked the rosary back in the tote bag, and she looked at me and said, "I hope you don't mind." I said, "Of course not." She said she found it helped. I said I imagined a lot of things helped when you were carrying what she was carrying. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said something that I have written down and kept ever since. She said, "You know what I've learned? The world is full of people who are struggling in ways you can't see, and most of them will not ask for help. They will smile. They will bring cookies. They will say they are going to be okay, and they will mean it. But they could still use someone to see them." I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would have been adequate. She turned back to the window. The clouds had lifted, and below us now was the open American West, dry and enormous, and crossed with roads that went somewhere and roads that seemed to go nowhere at all. About 30 minutes later, the man in 34C woke up with a tremendous snort and a slight look of confusion that resolved quickly into the practiced calm of a frequent traveler. He pulled out his phone. Rosa and I exchanged a small glance that was somehow conspiratorial. The shared language of people who have been quietly occupying the same small space. He introduced himself, actually, which was unexpected. His name was Marcus, and he worked in finance, he said, and then looked at me with that specific interested look that men in finance sometimes give other men in airports and on planes, trying to triangulate. I gave him nothing to work with. He pivoted to Rosa with the unconscious bias that people sometimes have, going warmer, going slower, as if age and softness required a different register. She was perfectly gracious. She answered his questions briefly and honestly, and at some point she mentioned Daniel in the hospital, and something in Marcus's demeanor shifted. He went quieter. He asked a few careful questions, and then he told her, in a tone that was unexpectedly sincere, that his own father had been in a long hospital recovery several years ago, and that it was one of the hardest things he had been through, and that he hoped her son had good people around him. Rosa thanked him. She said she was the people. Marcus did not seem to know what to do with that, exactly, but he nodded and went back to his phone, and I think the conversation had touched something in him that he would not necessarily examine until later, if ever. The flight attendant came by again for a final beverage service, and I ordered a coffee, and this time Rosa ordered a tea, and when the flight attendant handed it over, Rosa said, "I can imagine you must be exhausted by this point in the flight." And the flight attendant, a young woman whose name tag said Brianna, looked genuinely surprised. She said, "It gets long sometimes, yeah?" Rosa said, "Well, you've been very kind." Brianna smiled, and it was the kind of smile that takes over a face before a person has decided to let it, and she moved on, and I thought, there she is again, seeing people. I was starting to understand something about Rosa that went beyond the specifics of her story. I was starting to understand that she was a person who had built her entire way of being around the act of seeing other people, not as a performance, not as a strategy, as a practice as natural to her as breathing, developed over decades of cafeteria lines where hundreds of kids came through every day, and she learned each one of them, their preferences, their moods, which ones needed an extra role on a bad day, which ones were going through something hard and needed to be spoken to like they mattered, because they did. She mentioned this eventually. She mentioned a girl named Priya who had gone through her cafeteria line every day for 4 years. who never talked, who kept her eyes down, who one day Rosa had given an extra brownie to without being asked, and who had looked up with so much startled gratitude that it had nearly broken Rosa's heart, and who years later had sent her a letter saying that small act of noticing had been one of the moments that helped her through a period when she felt completely unseen. One extra brownie. Rosa said it like it was nothing significant. Just something you do. Just the way you move through the world. But I knew, sitting there in 3-4B, that most people do not move through the world that way. I certainly did not. I moved through the world efficiently, strategically, purposefully. I was good at seeing the big picture. I was not always good at seeing the person in front of me. The descent into Los Angeles began with that particular drop in cabin pressure that you feel in your ears. And the seatbelt sign came back on with its familiar ding. And the city appeared below us gradually. That vast, impossible sprawl of Los Angeles spreading out to every edge of the visible horizon, brilliant in the afternoon light. Rosa looked down at it, and I could see her thinking about Daniel, knowing he was somewhere in that city, knowing she was almost there. I asked her if she needed help getting her bag. She said she had only a carry-on, her tote, and she was fine. I asked if she had a ride from the airport. She said she had looked up the bus route, and it was manageable, a transfer, maybe an hour and 15 minutes to the motel. I thought about my car, the car service I had booked that was already waiting at the terminal. The driver, whose job it was to take me to my hotel, which was a very good hotel with a very good bed and a room service menu I would probably ignore in favor of working until midnight. I thought about it, and then I made a decision. I said, I have a car service meeting me. I'd like to offer you a ride to the hospital, if you'll let me. It's not out of the way. She looked at me the way people look when they are calculating whether an offer is genuine and whether accepting it would cost them something in dignity or obligation. I said, no strings, no reason, just a car with empty seats going roughly in the right direction. She said yes, quietly, but without hesitation once she decided. We landed. We navigated the slow shuffle of disembarkation, and I retrieved my carry-on from 3 rows back, and Rosa got her tote from under the seat ahead of her, and we walked through the jetway into the terminal, and Marcus from 34C gave Rosa a genuinely warm handshake goodbye and told her good luck with her son, and she thanked him, and then it was just the 2 of us moving through the terminal toward arrivals. My driver, a man named Kevin who had been driving for me for 3 years and had long since learned not to be surprised by anything, was waiting at the curb with a discreet sign. He took one look at me in my hoodie and baseball cap and Rosa in her blue cardigan and did not blink. I said, Kevin, we're going to Cedars-Sinai first, please. He said, of course. Rosa settled into the back seat with a slight sigh that was relief and exhaustion, and something that might have been gratitude, but she wore lightly. The car was quiet and cool and clean, and I could see her taking in the leather seats and the water bottles in the door, holders and the tinted windows, and recalibrating something in her understanding of who I was. She did not ask. She just said, this is very kind. I said it was nothing. She said, it isn't nothing. You know that. We rode through Los Angeles traffic, which is always terrible, and that afternoon was particularly committed to being terrible. And we talked a little more easy talk, the talk of 2 people who have already done the harder talking and can be comfortable in the lighter space now. She told me about the neighborhood she had grown up in, and I told her about mine, and we found, not surprisingly, that there were parts of them that rhymed. When we pulled up to the main entrance of Cedars-Sinai, Rosa gathered her tote, and then she turned to me and she said, what is your name? Your real name? I had been using Nathan, my real first name, throughout the whole flight, but I had not offered the last name, and she had not asked. I said, Nathan Cale. She looked at me for a moment, and something moved across her face. A recognition, maybe, or the shadow of one. The name meant something to her. She did not say what. She said, "Nathan, thank you for listening. Not thank you for the ride. Thank you for listening." I said I meant what I said on the plane, that I was sorry she was going through all of this, and that I hoped Daniel's recovery was swift and complete and easier than she was expecting. She said, "I have faith that it will be. And I believe you needed this flight too. I don't know exactly why, but I think you needed it." She said it gently, without any edge. Just an observation, offered freely. And then she got out of the car, and Kevin closed the door, and she walked through the sliding doors of the hospital, and she was gone. I sat in the back of that car for a moment in the particular silence that follows an encounter that has shifted something in you. Kevin asked if I was ready to head to the hotel, and I said yes, and we pulled back into traffic, and the city moved past the windows in its usual indifferent, spectacular way. That night, in my hotel room, I did not work until midnight. I sat on the balcony, and I looked at the lights of Los Angeles, which go on forever in every direction, and I thought about Rosa. I thought about Daniel, a man I had never met who was 38 years old and in a hospital because of one random terrible moment, whose mother had just crossed the entire country on a budget ticket with a tote bag of homemade cookies because she could not be anywhere but near him. I thought about George and his kitchen notes. I thought about Kriya and the extra brownie. I thought about a bench in the right corner where the afternoon light came in longest. And I thought about my company, about the 4,000 people who worked in our facilities, about the warehouse in Ohio and the contract negotiation I had been treating as a strategic problem to be solved efficiently, about the summaries and the projections and the optics. I got out my laptop and I did not work on my conference presentation. Instead, I wrote a memo to my executive team. I told them I wanted us to delay finalizing the Ohio contract until I had personally visited the facility. Not a scheduled, announced, prepared visit. An actual visit, the way I used to visit facilities in the early days of the company, when everything was smaller and more immediate, and you could not pretend that the people were abstractions. I sent the memo. I closed the laptop. I went to sleep. The conference was 2 days. I got through it, gave my talk, did my meetings, and then on the third day, instead of flying home, I rented a car, an ordinary rental car, nothing special, and I drove to Culver City to an address I had spent most of the previous evening finding. I had hired a researcher, not to investigate Rosa, nothing like that, just to find Daniel's room number, just to understand where he was and how he was doing. Because I had thought about it for 48 hours, and I kept coming back to the thought that if I could help in some concrete way, I should. I walked into Cedars-Sinai, and I asked at the desk about patient services and the hospital foundation, because I had an idea, and the woman at the desk connected me to the right department, and I had a conversation with a hospital administrator named Linda, who was brisk and professional, and who, when I explained what I was thinking, went very quiet for a moment, and then said she would need to make some calls. I gave Linda my real business card, the one with my actual name on it. She looked at it. She looked at me in my hoodie and my baseball cap. She made the calls. What I did that afternoon is something I have not made public. I am not going to describe it in detail here because it is not about the amount or the gesture. It is about what it meant to me to do it, which was something I could not have explained clearly to anyone who had not spent 5 hours and 40 minutes in seat 34B next to Rosa. But I will tell you that before I left the hospital, a nurse came to find me in the waiting area and said that the patient's mother wanted to speak to me if I was willing. I was willing. Rosa came out into the corridor. She was wearing the same blue cardigan. She looked tired in a way that 3 days of hospital vigil will make anyone look, but her eyes were clear. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, you didn't have to do this. I said, I know, but I wanted to. She said, Daniel is sitting up today. He ate lunch. He told a joke, a bad one. She smiled when she said this. I said that sounded like excellent progress. She said, I prayed on that plane. I asked God to send someone kind. And then this man in the middle seat took a cookie. She laughed a little when she said it. And I laughed too. And for a second, it was just two people in a hospital hallway, laughing at the way things work out sometimes. Then she was serious again. She said, I looked you up. After you told me your name, I know who you are. I said, I figured you might. She said, why were you in economy class? And I told her the truth. I told her about Maya, and about Delia, and about the Ohio warehouse, and about what I was trying to remember. I told her that my daughter had told me I had forgotten what it felt like to be invisible, and that I had gone to that plane to try to feel it. Rosa listened to all of this with her full attention, the way she listened to everything, with a quality of presence that was becoming rare in the world. And when I finished, she said, and did you? Did you feel it? I said, I think I started to. Sitting next to you, I think I started to. She nodded. She said, invisible gets heavy. People carry it a long time before they put it down. I asked if there was anything else she needed, anything practical, for the next few weeks. She said, Daniel needs a good physical therapist when he's ready. Someone who won't be impatient with him because he pushes himself hard, and he needs someone who knows when to push back and when to give him room. I said I would find out who the best was in Los Angeles. She said, not just the best who sees him as a person. I said, I understand the difference. She said, I know you do. I think that's what you were learning on that plane. I left the hospital and drove back to my rental car and sat in the parking structure for a few minutes in the quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when something has landed, when something real has made contact with something real inside you. I want to be clear about something. What I did at that hospital was not a transaction. It was not charity performed to feel better. It was the result of something I had genuinely, finally understood. And understanding was the thing that mattered, not the action itself, because action without understanding is just gesture. And I had spent a lot of my life performing gestures. I flew home 2 days later. Commercial flight, not economy this time. I was not trying to perform anything. I was just flying home. But I was paying attention differently. I noticed the flight attendants. I noticed the people in their seats, their faces, their postures. I thought about their lives the way I had thought about the people on the Atlanta flight, not with pity, just with acknowledgement, with the understanding that every single person in that cabin was a whole and complete human being, with a George who left notes on the counter, or a Daniel in a hospital somewhere, or a garden planned for a corner where the afternoon light came in longest. When I got back to New York, I called Maya. We talked for 3 hours. I told her what had happened. Most of it. The parts that mattered. She was quiet for a long time when I finished, and then she said, Dad, I didn't think you were actually going to do it. I said, I almost didn't. She said, what made you? I said, a woman on a plane offered me a cookie before she had taken one for herself. And I thought about that for the whole flight. Maya was quiet again. And then she said, I want to meet her someday. I said I hoped she would. 3 weeks later, I flew to Columbus and spent 2 days at the Ohio warehouse, not announced. I talked to workers on the floor during breaks. I ate lunch in the break room. I asked questions, and I listened to the answers without looking at a screen or thinking about where I needed to be next. I listened the way Rosa had listened to me on that plane. I heard things that the summaries had not captured. I heard about a supervisor who was good and fair and made the work feel possible. I heard about safety concerns that had been raised and not addressed quickly enough. I heard about the commute, which for many of the workers was an hour each way on inadequate transit, which meant their 12-hour shift was actually 14 hours of their day. I heard about a woman named Felicia who had worked there for 9 years and knew every system better than anyone, including management, and who had never been promoted and had stopped asking. I went back to New York and I called my executive team into a room and I said, I went to Ohio. Here is what I found. And then I talked for an hour without slides or summaries. And then I said, we are going to fix this. Not because it is good PR, not because the union negotiation requires it, because it is right. And because every person in that warehouse is a whole person with a life that matters. And the fact that I had to fly economy class and eat a cookie and listen to a stranger to remember, that is probably the most embarrassing professional development story I will ever tell. The room was very quiet. Then Delia, from the far end of the table, said, for the record, I suggested this. And she said it completely without smugness, which is the mark of someone who is right, so often they do not need to perform being right. I said, yes, Delia, you did. We settled the Ohio contract 3 months later. Felicia got promoted to Senior Operations Lead, and she sent me a 1-sentence email that said, thank you for listening, which I read and then had to sit with for a minute before I could respond. Daniel recovered. It took 8 months, and Rosa told me it was hard, and there were setbacks, and it was not linear, because recovery never is, but he recovered. The last time I heard from Rosa, she had flown back to Atlanta. She was in her garden. She had tomatoes coming in and zinnias just beginning to bloom, and she had put a bench in the corner where the afternoon light comes in longest, and she sat there every evening for 20 minutes, and she said it was everything she had hoped it would be. I think about her often. I think about what it cost her to get on that plane with her tote bag and her cookies and her rosary and her faith in things getting better after everything she was carrying. I think about the efficiency with which she deployed her limited resources, her time, her money, her emotional reserves, none of which she had in abundance, and all of which she gave fully when they were called for. I think about what she said on the plane. The world is full of people who are struggling in ways you can't see. Most of them will not ask for help. They will smile. They will bring cookies. They will say they are going to be okay, but they could still use someone to see them. Maya came to New York for Thanksgiving that year. First time she had done that in 4 years. We cooked together, badly, in my apartment, and it was imperfect and loud, and the turkey came out 20 minutes later than planned, and it was the best Thanksgiving I had had in a decade. She asked me at some point in the evening, after we had eaten, and we were sitting on the couch with the particular pleasant heaviness of people who have eaten well and feel safe, she asked me what had changed. I thought about it, really thought about it. I said, I think I stopped confusing success with understanding, and I stopped confusing busyness with presence. And I think I started trying to actually see people instead of just knowing they were there. She leaned her head on my shoulder the way she used to when she was very small, and she said, there you are. There you are. I did not fly economy class again to prove a point. That was never really the point. The point was to remember something I had let myself forget. And once you have remembered something essential, you do not need to keep reteaching it to yourself the same way. You just need to carry it forward. But I did change the way I traveled. I started sitting at the gate instead of the lounge before every flight. Not every time, not as a rule, but often enough that it became part of how I moved through airports. And sitting at the gate, I noticed things. I had conversations. Small ones mostly, the kind that last 5 minutes and go nowhere and mean something anyway. A retired nurse going to see her grandchildren. A young man heading to a job interview, nervous in the precise specific way that interview nervousness looks. Shoes a little too new, tie slightly too tight. A couple in their 70s, moving slowly, The man holding the woman's hand with the quiet confidence of someone who has been doing it for 50 years and has no intention of stopping. I noticed all of them. I looked. I think that is what Rosa gave me more than anything else. Not a lesson, because she was not trying to teach me anything. She was just being herself, fully and without apology, in a middle seat on a 5-hour flight. She was bringing cookies before she took one for herself. She was thanking the flight attendant in a way that landed. She was sitting with her rosary and her worry and her absolute rock-solid certainty that she would get to the other side of this, and Daniel would too, and the zinnias would bloom when the time came. She was just living. But the way she was living was something I needed to watch up close for a few hours in order to remember how to do it better myself. I called my daughter on the anniversary of the flight, just to say I was thinking of her, just to say thank you for the conversation that had sent me to that seat. She said, "You're being sentimental." I said, "I'm being grateful." She said, "Same thing." Maybe she is right. I turned 50 last year. I have had parties and celebrations and acknowledgments and awards over the decades, and I have appreciated them all and been moved by some of them. But the thing I think about on the quiet mornings when I am sitting with my coffee before the day begins, the thing that feels most real and most mine, is a 5-hour flight from Atlanta to Los Angeles. A scratchy middle seat, a man asleep in 34C, and a woman in a blue cardigan who offered me a cookie before she had taken one for herself, and everything that came after. If you take one thing from what I have told you today, I hope it is this. You do not need to manufacture experiences to find meaning. You do not need a program or a framework or a strategy. You need to be willing to take the middle seat sometimes. You need to be willing to be inconvenienced. You need to be willing to put down your phone and accept the cookie and ask how someone is, and then actually listen to the answer all the way to the end without thinking about your response. Because somewhere in this world right now, there is a Rosa. There is someone in a blue cardigan with a tote bag and homemade cookies, carrying something enormous with a grace that makes it look manageable, sitting next to a stranger who might need to hear about Daniel and George and the bench in the corner where the afternoon light comes longest. And that stranger might be you. I do not know what you are carrying today. I do not know what has brought you to this particular moment. But I know that most people are carrying more than they show, and most people are more generous than they appear when you give them the chance. And most people are waiting, on some level, for someone to see them. Be the person who sees them. That is the whole lesson. That is everything. Be the person who brings the cookies. Be the person who thanks the flight attendant in a way that lands. Be the person who gives the extra brownie without being asked. Be the person who puts the bench in the corner where the afternoon light comes in longest, and then actually sits there and looks at what is in front of you and lets it be enough. Because it is enough. It always was.